future reference as we continue this conversation. All right. So thank you very much for joining us. Abby. You're muted.
Thank you. I would just like to echo Dr. Hyde's welcome and words about the importance of these meetings and the importance of this historical moment. And thank you for being here with us for that. For those of you who are not necessarily on the mailing list that originally received this, but are chiming in and would like to be involved in our future, the next 3 weeks, please just send your email in the chat. Again, it will only go to the folks that you see on the screen, and then we can add you to that email list. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce our 3 speakers for the evening. They're going to talk for 30 to 45 minutes, and then we have the rest of the conversation reserved for your questions and their going back and forth and answering those questions. So our first speaker is Frank Argote-Freire. He's going to give a brief historical context to this discussion of policing. Dr. Freire is a member of the Kane History Department, and he's long been active in civil rights causes, specifically around issues of immigration. He's a leader in the Latino Action Network, and he's worked closely to build alliances with the African American community and to pass legislation promoting criminal justice reform. Most recently, he worked to secure New Jersey legislation to allow undocumented immigrants to apply for driver's licenses. After Dr. Freire, our next speaker will be Kevin Walsh, who's the acting state comptroller for the state of New Jersey. He leads the day-to-day operations of an office that audits and reviews government programs and operations, that investigates misconduct by government officers, that scrutinizes the legality of public contracts, and that recovers improperly expended Medicaid funds. Prior to joining the Office of the State Comptroller, Mr. Walsh spent the past 2 decades as a civil rights attorney and as the executive director of the Fair Share Housing Center. And in that capacity, something that's quite relevant to our discussion today, he successfully worked to abolish the death penalty in the state. Our final speaker will be the Reverend Dr. Charles Boyer. Yes? He is a 3rd-generation African Methodist Episcopal preacher. He's the pastor of the Bethel AME Church in Woodbury, New Jersey, and the founder of Salvation and Social Justice, a nonpartisan Black faith-rooted organization. Nationally, he's represented the Social Action Commission of the AME Church in several capacities, including the United States Senate regarding solitary confinement and the House of Representatives on gun violence. Dr. Boyer also co-authored the Anti-Poverty Network's report titled The Uncomfortable Truth, Racism, Injustice, and Poverty in New Jersey. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Freire.
Thank you, Abby. Thanks everyone for attending the seminar tonight. And I'm really happy to see on the participants list quite a number of my former students. So it's always a pleasure, even in this format, to see you or to know you're still out there and pursuing interests of social justice. So I thought I'd just start off briefly with a little bit of my personal involvement in communities across New Jersey as it involves the police. And one thing I have found historically in my work is that, so first of all, I find most police are really decent folks. And usually politicians, political officials use them as tools of coercion or to enforce public policy goals that really, or I should say when they're misused, they're used to enforce public policy goals which go beyond really this notion of keeping the peace. And so I have an example, and I've asked the moderators, Dr. Nicholson and Hyde, to make it available to you in the chat, this document of a report I wrote in 2009. We received complaints in Freehold that the governing body wanted the immigrants out. They had had a large influx of immigrants coming into the community in the late 1990s after NAFTA was passed. And so what we found was, or at least what the complaints were that the public officials were targeting the immigrants by going after their housing stock and by targeting their means of transportation. And so they often had these very late night inspections aimed at harassing people because they were arguing that the housing was overcrowded. And then when they targeted their transportation, they did two things. They were targeting the use of bicycles, because many immigrants commute to work on bicycles. If they're undocumented, they can't get a driver's license until this coming January, when they will be able to. So they commute via bicycle. And a second mode in which they were targeting them was what they called, I put in air quotes here, illegal taxis. So what this often consisted of is a family couldn't drop their children off at school in the morning, so they would have their neighbor do it, and they would pay them, you know, a small fee for a week. And so sometimes one person was dropping off 4 or 5 children at the school. This is a classic immigration or immigrant survival strategy, and they decided to deem them illegal taxis. So our organization, the Latino Coalition, the Latino Action Network, were asked to look into it, right? So we looked into the cases of ticketing in the borough, and what we found was the following. This report, as I say, is from 2008 or 2009. Of the 1,300 tickets reviewed for our study, 601 tickets, or 46.2%, were issued to Latinos. All right, so now at that time, the Latino population in Freehold Borough was about 30%. So already that was high, all right? But what was really shocking is what we found in the 2 areas of complaints that I mentioned a moment ago, that is illegal taxis and bicycle use. So here's what our study found. In the 2 specific categories brought to our attention by residents, the numbers were significantly higher. With regards to summonses issued for operating illegal taxis, listen to this for a minute, an overwhelming amount, 232 out of 247 tickets, that is 93.9%, were issued to Latinos in the period that we studied from July 1st, 2007 to June 30th, 2008. And as for the bicycle tickets, 82 of the 104 tickets, that is 78.8%, received for the period, again, same period, January 1st, 2007 to December 31st, 2008, were to Latino bicyclists. Okay, so anyway, we threatened to sue the community over this, and they finally backed off. But I think this is a good example and a small microcosm of how police forces can be used or misused, I should say. So anyway, the main focus, though, tonight has to do with the longstanding allegations of racial profiling that the state police have been accused of performing in New Jersey. And those allegations go back to the late 1980s. As early as 1989, the Public Defender's Office in Middlesex County, which is in New Brunswick, started to notice that the vast majority of out-of-state motorists that were stopped by state police were African American. And if you've driven along the New Jersey Turnpike, you know that the state police headquarters is right there off of exit 9 in New Brunswick, East Brunswick. So that is apparently, they alleged, a very heavily patrolled area of the New Jersey Turnpike. So keep that in mind, motorists. So anyway, the next piece of this was in the early 1990s, a few years after the flagging of this issue by the Public Defender's Office, African American state troopers filed a lawsuit against the state police, claiming they were being mistreated by their colleagues. They were being hazed by them and so forth. And they made up a very small percentage of the state police. So this later became an issue in terms of a settlement agreement. Probably the last straw, the most important straw to leading up to federal intervention in terms of the New Jersey State Police was a shooting that occurred in 1989. A story we've now heard often, in the aftermath of George Floyd, was two state troopers stopped this van on the New Jersey Turnpike. They, at some point in the discussions, they said they felt threatened, and so they fired into the van, wounding 3 of 4 young African American teenage men who were in the van. All right, so 3 of them were injured. So as I say, that's sort of a classic story. The troopers claimed they felt threatened. The folks in the van said they, in fact, weren't armed and were not threatening. Shortly after that, a newspaper, the Newark Star Ledger conducted an inquiry into stops on the New Jersey Turnpike, and they found that 75% of the folks that were stopped and arrested were either Black or brown folks, all right, African American or Latinos. So all of this, and then there are also civil rights leaders, primarily in the African American community, and religious leaders. They start complaining to the Justice Department, and that triggered an investigation by the U.S. Civil Rights Division in 1999. And they, in fact, concluded that the state police of New Jersey were engaged in ongoing racial profiling. And eventually the state police admitted it too. There's all sorts of other scandals that go on here. They conceal the information and so forth, which led to the firing of the state police director by Governor Christie Whitman at the time. So anyway, in the settlement agreement that ended the federal monitoring, because the federal monitoring of the state police went on from 1999 to 2009, the state police agreed to do certain things so they would not fall into this racist pattern again. And so that'll lead us to the report by Comptroller Walsh, who looked at whether or not, in fact, state police were doing as they said they were supposed to do. And he found some troubling findings. And then after Comptroller Walsh, Reverend Boyer will, in the long tradition of powerful African-American civil rights leaders, tell us about, the current scene, what he's observed. I believe it was his own denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, that were among the leaders in filing those complaints with the Justice Department. So perhaps he can give us some overview of that. And then I know in my conversations with Reverend Boyer that there were some ideas about reforms in New Jersey that he and others wanted to see happen in terms of police here in New Jersey. So, and then we'll open it up for questions. So without further ado, I pass the baton here to Comptroller Kevin Walsh for his overview of what he found in terms of follow-up to the state police racial profiling subject.
Great. Can you see my presentation there now?
Yes.
Great. Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me tonight to present my report on racial profiling and the New Jersey State Police's compliance with laws that were passed approximately 11 years ago at this point. I've been in this, in my current position in an acting capacity since being appointed by Governor Murphy at the end of January. And for 20 years, I worked on civil rights issues. So I have some familiarity with this in a broad way, but have enjoyed learning about it and in serving as a watchdog, which is really what my office does and what I've been charged with doing under the laws that created my office. We audit government, we evaluate efficiency, we look at contracts, we investigate where government may be falling short, and that would include violations of civil rights laws. And then Medicaid is an enormous part of the state budget, and we look out for folks who may be cheating in that and raising the costs of a program that is billions and billions of dollars. As you heard, the This all started decades ago, I'm sure, in lots of ways, but it came to a head in 1999 when the United States Department of Justice identified the practices of the New Jersey State Police as violating, among other things, the United States Constitution's Equal Protection Clause. And the state was sued in 1999 and very quickly settled and entered into a settlement that was approved by a federal court that very quickly began to change how the New Jersey State Police implemented its policies of practice, its motor vehicle stops under the law. And the order that was entered into between the federal government and the state of New Jersey really from beginning to end changed the way in which the state police practiced motor vehicle stops. The motor vehicle stops it required those stops to be documented. It required there to be checks on it. It required that the public find out about it and that training occur in certain ways. So from beginning with who gets stopped and why, all the way through the analysis, it was really a sea change, given what the federal government at the time, anyway, alleged had been happening. And even though in 1999 the state said that it was not racial profiling, it later come out and acknowledged that it was. And that happened pretty quickly as the state released thousands of pages of documents to the public that showed that 80% of the folks who were stopped on the turnpike and searched were Black and Latino folks that had been targeted based on their race. For 10 years, the federal government looked into this. They evaluated it, and at the end, including some of the clergy that were mentioned, the state police was found to have reformed itself. It was found to have become self-aware and self-monitoring, and that's 10 years, not a short period of time, but given that it involved institutional change, that was certainly something that was good for the state. And instead of then having the federal courts and the federal monitors and the United States Department of Justice's civil rights lawyers monitoring this, we passed a law in New Jersey that took all of those practices, evaluating from beginning to end what motor vehicle stops were executed and why. And we created a law we passed a law in New Jersey called the Law Enforcement Professional Standards Act. And it has, if you're interested in these issues, it's a good model for one to look at as to what police accountability can look like, because it has 4 key elements that could probably in some ways be tailored for other scenarios in which police accountability is an issue, whether it's use of force, whether it's how internal affairs complaints are processed. And those 4 elements here was a prohibition. Thou shalt not determine who to stop based on the race of the driver or the occupants. Secondly, the decisions that were made, that information around it and the justifications for the stops were all accumulated. The data was collected. The third part is that it's analyzed. And then once that data is collected and analyzed, there's multiple levels of accountability within the state police and within the Attorney General's office. Back to that point of the state police becoming self-aware and self-monitoring, that was continued in this new act passed in 1999. And then there's another element which is somewhat unique to this particular law and this particular approach, which is that the Office of State Comptroller was also inserted to monitor the state police and the Attorney General with regard to their assuring that racial profiling was not occurring. And so that took oversight to some extent outside of the chain of command, because the New Jersey State Police under our government reports to the Attorney General, but the office that I am in is independent. And although the governor appointed me and appoints people to this position, It is intended to be independent so that there can be a watchdog role in which the public's interests are protected. We just took we did a report, and we're supposed to do it annually. We just came out with a report about 6 weeks ago where we did a top to bottom look at the way in which the New Jersey State Police implements its policies and procedures for motor vehicle stops, from when the stop occurs all the way through the analysis that is supposed to happen as part of that. And the conclusion that we reached is that in general, the consent decree systems, the systems that were put in place back in 1999 under the 2009 law, remain in place and are generally being used. And at the same time, though, we found some issues that the state police should address and that the Attorney General should address. I made 8 recommendations, and here tonight I'm going to just briefly touch on 4 of them. The first one is that we found that the state police, back to basic accountability, is recording what it's supposed to record all the way up to and through, from the police stop all the way up until where the data is analyzed. There is a lot of information that is shared, but there is not a lot of information that is shared once they are asked questions. And so the Attorney General's position is that communications should be in writing. We've highlighted how that has not occurred, and the Attorney General's office at various points has said that has not occurred. And the recommendation we make is that the state police should be required to provide written responses. The state police was recognized as being self-aware and self-monitoring. And so what our report says is something that begins with an intense collection of data appropriately. At the end, the paper trail shouldn't fall short on that. This is, in order to hold the state police accountable and to make for a very effective system of accountability and oversight, it's important that the state police respond in writing so that there's a record of what's occurred. We've also suggested, consistent with what the Attorney General has said, that it is important that there be a benchmark. And as it stands right now, the state police evaluates itself based on what stops occur throughout the entire state police. What we've said and what the consistent following up on what the Attorney General's office has urged the state police to do is that that's not enough. It needs a system in which it evaluates the race of motorists who are on the turnpike and then determines whether the state police is pulling people over at a rate that is disparate to who is on the state police, who is on the New Jersey Turnpike, who those motorists are. We have, that is a request that has been made of the state police about 10 times in the past, and we've urged that it finally be implemented at this point. There's the recommendation urging that the external benchmark be used. The third one is sort of a formal one, but an important one. The state police leadership and the head of the state police, the colonel, the superintendent, are required to semi-annually swear that they have not allowed racial profiling to occur, and that the Jersey State troopers have complied with the requirements of the 2009 law. That has not happened to date, and the state police is committed, though, to doing it. And although it is a formality, it's an important one, because signing one's name to something is a helpful reminder. And the state police, although it's taking these obligations seriously, it should still comply with even the formal requirements, of course, of the law. Finally, the final problem that we identified that I'm going to touch on tonight is that about a 3.5-year delay has developed between when the data is collected and when it is analyzed and a public report is issued. And what we have said is that is too long, that these reports are supposed to be done annually and they're not being done annually, and that a 3.5-year delay is something that the Attorney General's office and the Office of Law Enforcement Professional Standards should improve upon. So just finally, and I'm happy to answer any questions, but if you know of something going wrong in government, whether it's abusive police practices or something else where government is falling short and spending money that it shouldn't be and violating public bidding laws and any of those sorts of things, please check us out on the website or call up our tips line. Tips are kept confidential, and they have led in the past to some of the more effective oversight that this office has done. Done, and Reverend Boyer, your turn.
All right, thank you, Kevin. And so I really appreciate being here tonight to talk about such an important topic. And yes, definitely would like to shout out Bishop Reginald T. Jackson, who then was Reverend Jackson, who spearheaded this from the African Methodist Episcopal Church here in New Jersey and the Black Ministers Council, and was on the forefront of this fight with various leaders. And one of the things that came out of this whole racial profiling piece that Frank and Kevin have so perfectly I think, gone over, is that part of what was supposed to come out of it was data reporting for all police, not just state police. Folks had envisioned, state officials and whatnot, that at that time, even municipalities would begin to do reporting. Use of force data as well would come out of this, which would have racial data, et cetera, et cetera. That was kind of part of the mix in the Milo at the time. And so individual police departments did begin to make those reports. But what happened is that most of those reports just sat in desk, and the Attorney General's office, the state police, were supposed to make a database, a central database, and were supposed to evaluate use of force data by race, et cetera, and that had not happened. New Jersey Advance Media took up the task and did Oprah requests and subpoenaed from over 500 police departments in the state and got the data, some of which was moldy and just never looked at, but they got a tremendous amount of that data and put together a report, which is called the Force Report. So I believe they published that in mid to late 2018. And what that showed was that here in New Jersey, by law enforcement self-reporting, that Black people were 3 times more likely to have force used against them than white people. We were 3 times more likely to be beaten, punched, hit with billy clubs, pepper sprayed, bitten by dogs, and shot than white folks. The data did not distinguish between folks who may represent as Black and folks who may represent as white when it comes to the Latino population. But I think most of us, if you're Black or Latino in New Jersey, you know that we are typically catching hell at the same rates. So it is, I think, enough to infer that this is consistent. What the report also found, what the research also found, was that white people were actually more likely to use physical force on police. And again, this is the police's, this is police officers' self-reported data. Black people were more likely to run. And so I think it makes sense. If I'm more likely to get beat over my head, of course, my reaction when I'm around law enforcement is typically going to be to run. And so we can see these major disparities. This put a major glaring light really all over again on the inequities and the systemic racism evident within New Jersey policing. And this time, it was more focused on local police departments than state police. I think what was the grand vision and the grand work of the state troopers was monumental, but it never really translated into local municipalities. I grew up in Plainfield, New Jersey. And I had no issues, and I grew up during the time of the racial profiling with the state police. So I grew up literally. I was the guy with my license on the turnpike. I was the guy getting pulled over, and at that time, you know, it was right around the time of NWA and all those. So I felt all of that viscerally because I felt the brunt of New Jersey racist policing. And I grew up in Plainfield, and my issues typically were not in Plainfield. They typically were in Scotch Plains and Westfield and Summit. If you know, we're talking to Keene University folks, so you all know the landscape, and Cranford and you know, so you all know what I'm talking. That's where I felt the brunt of policing. And so here, what we did after we saw what New Jersey Advanced Media, we launched hearings all throughout the state. And we went into Black faith spaces. And we talked solely to community members. We did not open it up to law enforcement because, as many of you have been in these sessions, I'm sure you've seen, the police come out, you got a faith leader, and they do all the talking, and they say, yeah, we got to do better, and we're going to do training. And then the community gets about 10 minutes at the end to talk, and then nothing changes. We wanted to really do just the opposite, to really document and understand what the community was facing. And what the community was facing mirrored one of the glaring pieces in the report, which was the report highlighted that the majority of use of force incidents against Black people were not happening in Black towns. They were actually happening in white towns that had proximity to mostly Black towns and cities. And if you know anything about the landscape of New Jersey, just like I'm talking about in Union County, you know where you catch hell is when you leave your designated, Black or Latinx portion of New Jersey. So we're in Union County. We're designated to Plainfield and Elizabeth, and maybe some Rahway, a little bit of Roselle, but those other places is a whole nother piece, and Union proper. And so part of what we fought at the same time, we fought for from an advocacy lens, was the independent prosecutor bill, which got passed, which mandated that when someone died because of police force, that the Attorney General's office would have to handle the investigation. All of this is happening in the midst of the use of force report, and also what happened with Jameek Lowry in Patterson, who died in police custody mysteriously and videotaped. And all of this predated, and I'm so grateful for this discussion, because there's a lot of energy, and rightfully so, around the George Floyd situation, and a lot of law enforcement. We see pictures here in New Jersey. All of a sudden, they are proponents of Black Lives Matter, and they're marching and all of those things. But we have fought like hell, tooth and nail, for years over systemically racist and blatantly racist police policies here in New Jersey, long predating George Floyd. And so it is critically important that we stay engaged. I just want to give you a couple of facts and figures, and then give you some concrete items that we at Salvation and Social Justice are working on given this situation. We spend nearly $50,000 a year in New Jersey to incarcerate someone, an adult. We spend $300,000 a year to incarcerate a young person in New Jersey. My good friend, Brandon McCoy at New Jersey Policy Perspective, in some preliminary research, has identified nearly $1 billion in the state budget, not even municipalities, in only the state budget of dollars spent enforcing drug criminalization in policing and prisons. $1 billion, to be exact, it's like 887 million, almost $1 billion just in drug enforcement. And so when we are hearing these cries from the street about defunding police, what it is, it's really a cry about making sure that we invest in communities. And this becomes critically important, right? Because for us, with all of the pieces that I have laid out, it is critical that when we look at this moment, that it is not merely PAL leagues, basketball games, softball games, and coffee with a cop, right? We have to look at deeper structural changes that change the dynamics of how things currently are. I had a very interesting discussion in Pennsylvania today with a gentleman who used to be the captain of the police chief of the Bethlehem Police Department, but he went on to become the police chief of the Lehigh University Police. And part of what he said was enormously eye-opening. And he said, the way we deal with policing in a campus environment is drastically different than we did on a municipal level. In the campus environment, we put all kinds of resources up front because we don't prioritize criminalizing. Our number one priority is the actual well-being of the students and their safety. And I know we've had some, incidents on certain campuses here and there, but for the most part, what he was saying, because this was in the midst of talking about how we better fund the front end priorities, a discussion that I've had with whether it be the Attorney General, county prosecutors, or officers across the board. All of us are in agreement that society has failed people all along the continuum, and we have divested from everything up front, education, mental health, et cetera, and we have left the burden on law enforcement to figure everything out, and then we say they need better training. Well, I mean, what other profession are you supposed to do safety, mental health, youth issues, drug pop? For most of us, like somebody like Frank, right? He has a doctor in front of his name because he has a specialization. But we expect law enforcement to be specialized in everything, to be able to identify everything. And this is enormously unfair, both to communities and law enforcement. So some of our priorities, very quickly, is, and these priorities are mapped for two different things. One is accountability and two is priorities. Until we change the accountability structure, we will always have these problems. So one, we must undo somehow on a state level, both federally, most importantly, but also on the state level, qualified immunity. We have to change the deadly force standard. We cannot allow police officers to say, I feared for my life. If there is not an actual threat on your life, it should not be a reason to take somebody's life. Two, we are looking at county level community accountability boards. Just like I said before, most of these use of force incidents are not happening primarily in Black cities. They are happening in white towns. So we need county level, and those appointments need to be made by organizations such as the NAACP, Latino Action Network, the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. The appointments to those boards should be made by justice advocacy organizations, not by mayors and not by people who are just going to appoint former retired law enforcement and prior prosecutors and folks who are just going to continue to protect police interests over community interests. Thirdly, we have to dismantle the power of police unions. The Attorney General, for instance, you know, even though at one time we were kind of going back and forth because originally he was against the independent prosecutor piece, but has, you know, worked hand in hand with us in a lot of these changes and a lot of the pieces within the excellence in policing community. He's done a very good job since then, really working with communities and especially in this environment, trying to make changes, notwithstanding the pieces that Kevin has brought up. But they put out the directive about departments publishing the data about bad actors. And he's got major pushback from police unions in response, so much so that they even went and published his home address, right? Which is just basically a terroristic threat. We have to dismantle the power of police unions. And finally, we need community-led first responders. We need to reimagine what first response looks like. We need to fund, we need to prioritize funding and community-led first responders for health, mental health, trauma, youth, drug situations, family situations, so that we have a different response than showing up in Black and brown communities. A white guy with a gun should not be the go-to. We need to reimagine public safety. And finally, when people say we can't afford that, yes, you can. You're already spending the money, but you're spending it on the deep end rather than the front end. And it is a matter of priorities, not a matter of ability. And that's what I got. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for this. This was incredibly important to hear these kind of on the ground, this is what's happening in our local communities and at the state level. I think we talk about these things so much in terms of broad national statistics and broad national trends, and getting to understand what is happening in our state and in our community, I think offers us the opportunity not only to learn from what's happened, but also to think about a path forward. Dr. Freire, I know you would like to begin with a question for the other two panelists, and then please, for those of you who are attending, this is a good time for you to offer your questions to us, and we can bring them before the panelists as well. Frank, you are muted.
Thank you, Dr. Purkis. So, yes, I had two different questions, one for Kevin and one for Reverend Boyer. So my question for Kevin is, I've heard the comptroller issue this report or explain this report before, and I have to say I am really troubled by the fact that the state police are so far behind in analyzing this data to judge whether, you know, racial profiling is ongoing at the present time. And I just think it behooves all of us to let the Attorney General know that we expect this data to be compiled in a timely fashion. And I don't know if you received an answer to your recommendation from the Attorney General, but that just disturbs me to no end. And then let me just touch on my other question for Reverend Boyer. But the question I have for you, Reverend, is these county level community reliability boards. So since Kane is in Union County, let's just use that as an example. And I know you're a native of Union County. So if you had such a board in Union County and there was a complaint about a police officer in Cranford, let's say, how would that function? How would the county community level board function to determine whether this police officer should be disciplined? Would the community board have any teeth to it to enforce anything? Would it have subpoena power? How would that function in a practical sense? So anyway, those are my two questions. Thank you, Dr. Perkis, for giving me a moment there.
Yeah, so I'll just jump in and say that the Attorney General's office is committed to looking at the report and figuring out the right way forward. I don't think they've said more than that publicly. There was a couple newspapers articles on it, but I think that answers your question. Was there anything else? Sorry, I was focused on the other question. Is that good for?
Well, it'd just be great if we would have a more clear declaration of when they plan to catch up.
Yes, so I don't think we have that yet. The one thing that they said, and this was before COVID, and this is mentioned in the report, is that they're supposed to be putting all of this data online this summer. I'm not going to be surprised if that's delayed somewhat, but one advantage of that would then be that others could dig in, including academics, to evaluate and provide another layer of review. And I think that would be a positive move for transparency. But they did just issue a report at some point after I issued my report in May that covered, I think, the first 6 months of 2018, maybe something along those lines. And so hopefully they'll get more reports out soon, but I don't think we have a timetable.
Yeah. So to about the county level boards. So yes, we believe they should have subpoena power. Yes, we believe this officer would have to come before this board. Some functional pieces. One, we lift up the NORC model, which is only city-based. So our only real difference is that it would be county-based instead, so it would be broader. But that is a CCRB that has some teeth to it. We'd actually like to see even more teeth to it. The original CCRB that was envisioned in the work by the ACLU really had a robust board which was able to fire and discipline the officers as well. And that's where we see is necessary in order to have true accountability. Some of the things that I think that the AG and others, I think there's some reasonable things, like one, these folks should be sworn in and they should be sworn to secrecy, because in order to protect an investigation. There can be training around that, but we do not agree with the Attorney General's recommendations that these boards would only begin to be able to review things after the police have done their investigation, because we're just in the environment, and I think history has shown us that we can't necessarily trust that. So we believe these things should be happening at the same time and in communication with each other. But we do agree that these folks will have to, we know that investigations can be undermined, but certainly if you can trust police, you should be able to trust the community. There's no reason why any of us should ever say in our minds that police are more trustworthy than community members. And so we reject that outright.
Frank, do you want to chime in again before we get to questions from the audience?
No, I mean, thank you. That was very, yeah, that's really thought-provoking. On the issue of qualified immunity, I mean, when I've spoken about this in different forums in the last month or so, usually someone comes up and says, will lifting qualified immunity hinder a police officer? In other words, will they act so scared? Will it scare them so much that they won't be able to do their enforcement functions if you allow them to be subject to what one person called a litigious society? Would that make them unable to function properly? I just throw out, that's come up a bunch of times, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, Reverend.
Well, I think I think that is the community check. What we've done is just the opposite. We have incentivized abuse, where people can literally take someone. If we cannot give someone the ability to take someone's life and then give that in such a blanket way that there's no accountability. And that's what we've done. And so with Jesus put it this way, to whom much is given, much is required. So if you have license from society to take someone's life, you better have a good case for doing it. And I think we have seen over time, without doubt, that I think most of us would rather try the other end. I mean, do you think community members are going to be in an uproar if someone who is truly a dangerous threat gets taken out or gets hurt and then tries to sue? Do you think that there's going to be community uproar over that? Of course not. And one of the things that I try and remind law enforcement all the time is that in Black communities, or whatever community you're in, but particularly Black communities, we are victims as well of crime. So we really see this, poverty puts us in such a position where we're on the receiving end. Some of the most hardcore people on crime you're ever going to meet is Black folks. But we see crime from two instances. One, the crime that poverty produces, and two, the crime that policing produces. And we want some equity.
Thank you, Reverend Boyer. I think that's an important and powerful note to end on in terms of this internal conversation, and turn to some of the questions, which I think very much implicate these same ideas you're talking about in terms of community versus policing and getting away from that model. One of the first questions that we received was about the demographics of the New Jersey State Police Force. Do you have a sense of the number or percentage of women on the force, the percentage of people of color, of women of color? And I will extrapolate from that question. Is there evidence to support the idea that when the police force is more diverse, there are fewer instances of police violence, there are shifts in these community policing dynamics? That question is for everybody, so whomever would like to answer.
So in regards to the state police, and don't quote me on these, but I did hear the Attorney General, he spouted these off the other day. So I'm probably off, but not horribly off. I believe about 6% of the state police are African American, or maybe even less than that. I believe it's closer to 3% are women. I believe that maybe 10, 15% tops are women. I believe that maybe 7% is Latino. It's something like that, but it's obviously way, and it's getting worse. The numbers are going down. So in regards to diversity, that's going down. I don't know about the more diverse, the less the abuse. I'm not sure we have too many models of that statewide. We don't really have many very diverse police departments to draw from. But the piece that I do think is good for us in consideration is we do know the more some data we do have is the more women are less likely to use force. Not that they don't, but they're less likely to use force. And we also know the better educated a police officer is, police officers with college degrees are far less likely to use force. So those are data points that I think are very instructive in regards to this situation.
When somebody asked that in the chat, I immediately rushed to my phone and Googled the data. Unfortunately, two things I would say. So the numbers are a little, I found only a 2007 report on the state police, which of course is very outdated. But strikingly, similar numbers to those reported by Reverend Boyer from a recent discussion he had with the AG. And yeah, it was about 8% African Americans and 5% Latinos. This is 2007, and 3% women. It sounds like the number of women has increased quite a bit, but just totally, unsatisfactory. I will note, for those of you who are interested, in my Google search, I did find that the Attorney General Grewal has issued in 2017 a report on diversity, which looks at hiring practices across New Jersey. So I didn't get a chance to look into it to see if the state police were included, but I would think they would be. So.
Kevin, would you like to chime in, or should we move on to the next question?
I don't have anything I can add to that, unfortunately.
Great. Well, thank you. I think that gives us just those basic statistics and lack thereof, I think gives us a lot to think about. We have a few questions about training and police academies, and I'm going to kind of consolidate them into one question. What are your thoughts both on the time lengths and training topics at police academies, and also on kind of the practices and culture of various police training programs, whether these are specific academies or programs embedded within other colleges and universities around the state? And do they foster or perhaps subvert these community policing relationships? My apologies, my dog is entering the Zoom.
So one of the things that the Office of State Comptroller has done in the past, and I think it has been in two different reports over the years, is to evaluate the state police and training and how that relates to racial profiling. And one of the things that the state police has done in the past is when there have been problems in that started to show up in the data, they went back and looked at the training and realized that there was a direct connection between the training and the data, and troopers being trained in ways that were inappropriate. And they corrected it, and it showed back up in the data that they had corrected it, and they were appropriately given credit for making those changes. And so one of the things that the law that's in place that's required, that is the basis of the report that I recently issued, is that same law also requires an analysis of training. And so I can't say more than that right now, although the accountability elements that are in place recognize the importance of training as a way to ensure that racial profiling isn't occurring.
So years ago, Monmouth County asked me to prepare a presentation for some of the police departments in the county. And so I would go to them, and I could always tell, some of them would even start to tease me. I was the sensitivity guy coming in to talk to them about, immigrants and dealing with the immigrant community. I felt it was worthwhile to do it because I think I still was able to get through to some folks, but some folks clearly felt that, as I said, I was there to sensitize them, and they didn't like that a great deal. I remember though that they stopped asking me to do it when I would reveal to them some of the complaints that were in the newspapers or that the community had about policing. I remember the guy from the prosecutor's office said to me, you gotta stop doing that. I can't have you do these anymore. And I said, well, I mean, what kind of dialogue are we having here? So anyway, but I was uninvited from those seminars. So anyway, it was just, that's my little reflection on the types of training. I do feel it was important. I was able to get through to a certain segment, particularly when I would explain to them that immigrants in the past have all been treated poorly, and that very much, was the case that immigrants of an earlier era were also scapegoated for the society's problems, and that they should remember that. And little things like in Latin America, when you're addressing a police officer, it's probably not a good idea to look them straight in the eyes and give them a sense of defiance. If you think the oversight of police is lacking here in the United States, some of the countries of Latin America are much worse than that. So anyway, I do feel it was of some value, but like I said, I don't know that it was taken seriously enough, and I was censored. There was an effort to censor my message.
I just want to chime in a little bit there, because I think Dr. Fryer really, our whole position on training is important, but it's almost only as good as the posture of the one receiving it. We're hoping to change some of the discussion, not change it, but redirect some of the thinking that is solely in the training area, and looking for really some education institution support around testing, right? There's tons of implicit bias testing that universities have done, and we can all go online right now and take a racial bias test. And so the question is, why are we not testing officers before they ever come in? As a clergyman, before I can even petition my denomination to walk the walk towards ordination, before I can be admitted into seminary or anything, the first thing, I have to have a psychological evaluation and a whole background to make sure that I don't have anything in my mind, my spirit, or my background that would preclude me from entering ministry. Given where we are, we should have racial bias testing before someone can even get into the academy. Why are we even admitting people when we have, I think, the mechanisms to understand what kind of racial biases people have? And if they have those biases, then they can't be admitted.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot to tease out there and to think through in terms of how we move forward, not only with the people that are already officers, but also those that are looking to become. We have 9 minutes left. I think we're all pretty committed to sticking to this 8:15 timeline. So I'm going to ask 2 more questions. The first is somewhat ancillary to the conversation specifically about race, but I think a very important question posed by one of our attendees. And then I'm going to try to consolidate the last several questions, which all deal with kind of our current state in light of the George Floyd protests, in light of the Black Lives Matter current movement, and where we go in terms of policing policy, in terms of defunding. So that's the direction we're going to go in our final 8 minutes. The question that is a little bit more tangential, but I don't think any less important, is what role do you see for the disability community in the selection of these community review boards? The questioner says that they can tell from their own experience a less direct but no less real monitoring from authorities.
I'm not sure if Frank is.
Yeah, I was trying to unmute, but now I've succeeded. Yeah, I think diversity, I think Reverend Boyer, I think will agree with what I'm about to say, but I mean, obviously in these diversity boards, diversity is the key. You know, I've had students with different physical handicaps. I can't understand the struggles that they go through completely. I can learn, and I think that's why we need to have diversity in all segments of our society. And so I would imagine that that would be real important to have that sort of diversity included, you know, not only racial and ethnic diversity, but, you know, those who have issues, physical and so forth.
Yeah, I 1000% agree with that. I mean, as much as we talk about the dynamics between, white privilege, this, that, there's the dynamics around patriarchy, there's the dynamics around ableism, ageism, and so all of us operate in different areas of privilege. And so I think it is always critically important to make sure that voices which have been traditionally marginalized are brought to the table, because that is how we have the most informed, I think, just and righteous and moral way of moving forward.
Okay, and in our final 5 minutes, over the last 5 weeks, as we have seen these persistent protests, we have also seen really loud calls for changes to the way we think about policing and police forces in our country. And we see some cities moving toward a model of defunding police. We see conversations about dismantling police. The language differs, and I think probably the scope of these reforms differs, but there are a number of questions about kind of how you view that conversation, what you see as a possible alternative. If funding is withdrawn from police, where might it go? Reverend Boyer, you've spoken quite powerfully about the responsibility, the vast responsibilities that are placed upon police officers, and perhaps ill-placed at this point. So where do we go from here? We see Camden and Newark being used as national models here. Camden was on the front page of CNN. Are those models that we can use? Are there other models we should look toward?
I'm not sure we have a real model to draw from. I think, in the petri dish of America, we're going to do a lot of experimenting now. I mean, the privilege that I have as a preacher is that I can shoot for the stars. My job is to shoot for the absolute stars and to have as little pragmatism as possible. I'm trying to pull legislators and everybody all the way to as much of an envisioned just society. And the piece that I would put out to people is that and I want to correct something that I said. I think we do have models of this all around us. In affluent white communities, we do not have massive police presence. We see it all around us. We do not have, if the police are there, they're at the borders, protecting the community from what they consider outsiders. So I think a much better model than Camden and Newark is Westfield. Westfield, you don't see cops just all over the place and running down Westfield residents. It doesn't happen. And why? Because Westfield residents have everything they need. They're not hungry. They have housing. They have some of the best education in the country. Every resource you can think of, they have. Poverty breeds crime. Poverty breeds desperation. And so what's crying out from the streets right now is equity and repair and justice. And if every citizen has what they need, we would not need the policing which we have right now. And so I challenge people to really look at the models all around them and think about where our priorities are. Because we do spend the money. Again, we already spend the money, but we have chosen, and we will always find money to police more. We will always find money to incarcerate more. But the first places we cut are the places that actually take care of people on the front end.
Yeah, one of the questions that you asked was what are the models? And the report that I issued was focused on the state police, and someone in the comments sent around the uniform crime report data it's somewhat dated. I'm thinking there's more recent out there, but as of 1999, there were 35,000 total police officers 38,000 total police officers in the state of New Jersey. And of those, less than 3,000 were state police officers. And so let's assume that's bumped up a little bit. I don't know, but in that neighborhood, that means that there are 34,000 police officers whose data is not recorded when they stop a person for a motor vehicle violation, and 2,000 or 3,000 that are. And so the one thing that one can say with confidence about the state police is that it is, even though I found there are things it could do better, it is one of the most scrutinized police departments, police entities in the state. And that level of scrutiny for folks who care about this issue could be applied to other police officers, and there would probably be benefits from a racial justice standpoint as well, I would expect.
Frank, would you like to have the last word?
Well, I think they did a much better job of the last word than I, but since I am last to go, I guess I will have the last word. But in terms of a model, I don't think I could sum it up any better than what Reverend Boyer said. Now, mind you, I'm an eternal optimist, but I'm the type of guy who thinks he has more money in his bank account than he actually has. I'm one of those type of optimists. But I'm really enthused with what I'm seeing around the nation, in the sense that I've never seen so many police officers fired before, ever. I mean, usually in my memory, it was very hard to fire any police officer, and there's been a number of them charged, and New York City is defunding, or I do think the defunding term is not quite the right term. It's a terrible, as being a former press secretary, I think it's a terrible word, because it's not really defunding, it's shifting funding. But anyway, I just think it scares folks, some folks. So I'm really excited about what I have seen in terms of New York City and Minneapolis defunding. And for me, as a historian, I'm into this nerdy stuff, but they got rid of the name of Woodrow Wilson in their foreign policy school, and these Confederate statues and the questioning about history. For me, I just love this. I think this is actually creating an environment where people will know their history more, and therefore they'll understand the origins of the movements they see on the street. And I think it'll build a better understanding between people. So I'm jazzed up about what's happening. I'm really happy about it, and I just hope we can get now beyond some of the symbolisms and some of the immediate firings and charging of police, some structural reforms, like those that were mentioned by Reverend Boyer earlier in the evening. So thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you to Dr. Freire and Comptroller Walsh and Reverend Boyer. As a Department of History, we often really look to the past to provide us with models for how we can move forward. And I think you have shown us that we don't need to look very far, and that there's a lot going on in this immediate moment that we can draw from. And you're showing us that the last 10 years offer us amazing resources to think through and to move forward with.
Thank you, Dr. Purkis, and thank you, Frank and Kevin and Reverend Boyer. Just absolutely wonderful conversation. To echo what Abby just said, not needing to look far to look for models for change. And I think that we're all here tonight because we believe in the power of learning, and we believe in the power of listening, and we've been able to to learn a tremendous amount about being honest with our past and how we can use that to look ahead, to build a better future. And my goodness, what an important lesson in looking at how much and how many parts of our society are needed from a governmental perspective, from the grassroots perspective, in order to bring about change, in order to bring about the kind of learning that is needed to achieve that. So I'm just tremendously grateful for all of you for participating in our conversation and making this conversation available to our larger community. We have shared via the chat a number of the links that were referenced, links to the reports that were mentioned in the conversation. We will also be sending out a follow-up email, and we can include those links in our follow-up email to our mailing list. And again, invite anyone who is attending this evening who did not receive the invitation to our Zoom meeting via our mailing list. Please feel free to use the chat feature right now in order to share your email address with us so that we can add you to that mailing list. Two more pieces of business. Thank you to Dr. Nicholson, who has been responsible for making our tech work this evening. And we're very excited to be able to record and share to YouTube and so forth, because, as you know, we feel very strongly that this conversation needs to reach as wide an audience as possible. And a reminder that we will meet again next Tuesday, when our topic will be art and race. We'll have art historical context being offered by our art history faculty, Professors Mayhall, Kacher, and Stoneberg. And then we're going to have with us hopefully several members of the Kane art history community who organized and participated in a protest art exhibit in Jersey City a couple of weeks ago, as a direct response, of course, to the Black Lives Matter protests. So please join us here again 1 week from today on Tuesday, July the 7th. I perpetually get dates wrong, but I believe it's Tuesday, July. It is Tuesday, and it is 7 p.m. And I believe that is July the 7th. So thank you again, everyone, for participating in this important conversation. And we will see you next week.